As a wedding planner for 8 years, I thought I'd seen it all. Bridezillas, drunken best men, mothers-in-law who wore white just to spite their daughters. But nothing could have prepared me for Delilah's consultation that March. She walked into my office looking like she'd stepped straight off a magazine cover designer dress, flawless makeup, an engagement ring bright enough to blind someone. But her hands trembled as she filled out the intake form. "I need the most secure venue you have," she said, skipping any pleasantries. "Somewhere with gates, security cameras, the works." I'd planned celebrity weddings before, so naturally I assumed it was about paparazzi. I started pulling up photos of our gated estates and private resorts. She shook her head at every single one. "Do any of them have safe rooms?" she asked. That question stopped me cold. In 8 years, no bride had ever asked me about safe rooms. "Can you tell me what's worrying you?" I asked gently. Delilah's polished composure cracked, just slightly. She glanced around my office as though someone might be listening, then leaned in close. "My family doesn't know I'm getting married," she whispered. "And if they find out, they'll kill me. Literally." I'd heard plenty of dramatic family feuds before, but something about her tone made my blood run cold. This wasn't hyperbole. When I say literally, I mean they will murder me and my fiancé, she said, matter of fact. "My brother already tried once, when he found out I was dating Caspian. Shot at us through our apartment window. We've been in hiding for 6 months." I set down my pen. This was far beyond ordinary wedding planning territory. "Maybe you should think about postponing until things settle down." "There is no settling down," Delilah cut in. "My family runs the Kozlov organization. You've probably heard of them." I had. Everyone in this city had heard of the Kozlovs. They controlled half the underground gambling scene, most of the drug trade, and had a body count regular enough to make the evening news. "Caspian is from the Romano family," she went on. "Our families have been at war for 3 generations. 17 people have died because of this feud. My father told me he'd rather see me dead than married to a Romano." My mouth went dry. Romeo and Juliet was a tragedy, not wedding inspiration. "So you want to marry in secret?" I asked. "Not secret. Public. Very public." Her eyes took on a strange gleam. "I want the biggest, most elaborate wedding this city has ever seen. Every news station there. So public they can't make us disappear quietly." I stared at her. It was either brilliant or completely insane. "The Romano family will cover everything," she said, sliding a black card across my desk. "No budget limit, but it has to be perfect. And it has to happen in 6 weeks. 6 weeks is impossible for a wedding this size." "It's not impossible, just expensive." She held my gaze. "I know you pulled off the Grantham wedding in 4 weeks when their daughter got pregnant. I know you have the connections." She'd clearly done her homework. That Grantham wedding had been a nightmare of rushed everything, but we'd made it happen for the right price. "There's something else," Delilah added. "The moment the invitations go out, both families will know. They'll have 6 weeks to figure out how to stop us. We need to make it impossible for them to succeed." I thought about the insurance liability alone and felt a little sick. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "Plan a wedding that keeps us alive long enough to say I do," she said simply. "After that, we're on our own." 3 days later, I was standing inside an abandoned warehouse with Caspian Romano, trying to work out how to turn it into a fortress disguised as a wedding venue. He was handsome in that dangerous way that makes smart women do foolish things, though his eyes never stopped scanning for threats. "The guest list is going to be interesting," he said, showing me his phone. "Half will be armed Kozlovs, half armed Romanos, plus legitimate guests with no idea they're walking into a potential war zone." That's when it hit me. What I'd signed up for wasn't wedding planning, it was survival planning. Caspian walked me through their strategy while I tried not to hyperventilate. The warehouse sat on neutral ground, technically city-owned, surrounded by businesses that closed by 6 p.m., with multiple exit routes, loading docks that could handle emergency vehicles, and concrete walls thick enough to stop bullets. "We'll need metal detectors," I said, taking notes. "Won't work," Caspian replied. "Both families have legitimate guests who carry legally, and anyone wanting to smuggle a weapon past a detector already knows how. Then how do we keep everyone safe?" "We don't," Delilah said, appearing beside us. "We just make sure the cost of starting a war is higher than the cost of letting us marry." The first week was a crash course in criminal family dynamics. Delilah explained how the feud began back in 1987, when her grandfather caught Caspian's grandfather skimming from their shared construction business. What should have stayed a civil lawsuit spiraled into 3 decades of bloodshed. Harsh words led to a fistfight, which led to a stabbing, which led to a shooting, which led to entire families picking sides. "My great-uncle Anatoly was the first to die," Delilah told me as we toured potential caterers, shot in the back leaving church. Caspian's family called it self-defense, but Anatoly was unarmed. That's when my family decided the Romanos couldn't be trusted. The revenge killing came 6 months later. Caspian's cousin turned up in the harbor with his throat cut. Both families blamed the other. Police couldn't prove anything, but the message landed clearly. This was now a blood feud. 17 people over 30 years, Caspian said during one of our planning sessions. 17 funerals. 17 families destroyed. For what, a construction contract that went bankrupt anyway? Learning the family history turned out to be essential for the seating chart alone. Every death had bred new enemies, new grudges, new reasons for violence. Delilah's cousin Marina couldn't sit near Caspian's uncle Roberto, since Roberto had allegedly ordered the hit on Marina's brother. Caspian's aunt couldn't be seated in the same section as 3 Kozlov women whose husbands had died in Romano-ordered attacks. It's like building a seating chart for 30 years of warfare. I told my assistant as we worked through the guest list. Everyone hates everyone else for specific, well-documented reasons. Vendor meetings became exercises in criminal psychology. Every supplier had to be vetted not only for quality and reliability, but for family ties and criminal associations. The wrong florist could be a Kozlov cousin looking for payback. The wrong caterer might have Romano connections and tamper with the food. My longtime cake baker, Margaret, had worked with me for 5 years, but when I ran her background check, I found her ex-husband was a low-level associate in the Petrov organization. That alone disqualified her. "I've never even met Viktor Petrov," she protested when I explained. "My ex just ran numbers for them occasionally." "Occasionally is enough," I told her. The Kozlovs would see any Petrov connection as a threat. Finding replacement vendors who were completely clean took weeks. Nearly every bakery, florist, and caterer in the city had some tie to one criminal organization or another, whether through family or protection payments. I eventually found a wedding cake specialist 3 cities over with zero criminal connections. She charged double her usual rate plus hazard pay, but agreed to build the most elaborate 5-tier cake I'd ever commissioned. I've done celebrity weddings, she told me during our consultation, but never one where I had to worry about the cake being used as cover for an assassination attempt. Dress shopping revealed just how isolated Delilah had become from her family. Traditional Russian weddings usually involve several generations of women helping choose the gown, but Delilah's mother wanted no part of it. She told me I was dead to her the day I picked Caspian over family loyalty, Delilah said as we browsed designer gowns. She won't even return my calls. Her grandmother, Babushka Yelena, became her only real family support. At 87, she was the matriarch who'd emigrated from Russia in 1962 and watched her family build an empire out of violence and fear. In old country, families fight over land, over politics, she told me in her thick accent while Delilah tried on her 7th dress. Here, families fight over nothing. Pride, stupidity, boys with guns who think they are men. Babushka Yelena had buried 3 sons to the family business, 1 to rival gangs, 1 to police, 1 to prison, where he died during a riot. She'd buried a husband gunned down outside a grocery store. She'd raised grandchildren who inherited hatred instead of love. Delilah is first to choose happiness over revenge, she said, running her fingers along the silk of the gown. Maybe she breaks curse on this family. The Romano side had its own drama brewing. Caspian's parents hadn't spoken to him since learning of the engagement. His mother called me directly, pleading for the wedding to be called off. You don't understand what you're facilitating, she said through tears. This isn't Romeo and Juliet. This is suicide. My son will be dead within a year. Why don't you support him, if you're that worried? I asked. Because supporting him means betraying everything his father stands for. My husband has spent 40 years building respect through fear. If he looks weak accepting this marriage, rivals will see it as an opening to move against us. The tangle of criminal family politics made ordinary wedding drama seem almost quaint. Every decision carried implications far beyond personal taste. The color scheme couldn't favor either family. The menu needed to blend Russian and Italian dishes without hinting at preference. Even the music required diplomatic thought. 3 weeks in, I finally grasped the full scope of what we were dealing with. Caspian handed over detailed intelligence his family had compiled on the Kozlov organization. Delilah, in turn, shared her family's surveillance files on the Romanos. Reading through them felt like studying military dossiers. Every relative had a profile covering criminal history, known associates, weapons of choice, even psychological notes. Both families had spent years bracing for a final confrontation. My uncle Dimitri's been buying explosives for 6 months, Delilah revealed during one session. He's convinced the Romanos are planning to bomb our legitimate businesses. My cousin Luca armored his car and hired ex-military bodyguards, Caspian countered. He's convinced the Kozlovs are planning coordinated hits. Both sides were armed, paranoid, and certain the other was gearing up for an imminent attack. Our wedding was landing at the exact moment 30 years of tension was boiling over. The threats escalated by the day. Someone firebombed a Romano-owned restaurant, causing $200,000 in damage. The Kozlovs answered by vandalizing 3 Romano businesses in a single night. Police stepped up patrols in neighborhoods tied to both families. Maybe we should relocate the wedding, I suggested after the firebombing. Vegas, somewhere neutral. No, Delilah and Caspian said, at the same moment. Running won't fix anything, Delilah explained. Our families will just follow us wherever we go. We need to face this here now, publicly. Besides, Caspian added grimly, if we're going to die, we might as well die in our hometown, where people can witness it. Their willingness to accept possible death was both inspiring and heartbreaking. Security planning turned into a military operation. Torres, our head of security, was a former Navy SEAL who'd handled executive protection for foreign diplomats in war zones, and even he seemed rattled by this job. I've protected people in Baghdad and Kabul, he told me during a briefing. But at least there I knew who the enemy was. Here, everyone's potentially dangerous. We built protocols for every scenario imaginable. If shots rang out during the ceremony, the wedding party would drop behind the altar while security engaged the threat. If bombs were found, evacuation would follow predetermined routes. If law enforcement stepped in, specific team members would handle the media. What if both families start shooting at each other? I asked. We hit the floor and pray, Torres said. At that point, it's urban warfare. The FBI's involvement added yet another layer. Agent Morrison began sitting in on our planning meetings, though her colleagues stayed undercover. She explained how federal agents would be woven into our security without blowing their investigation. We've been trying to get inside both organizations for years, she told me. This wedding hands us unprecedented access to leadership from both families under one roof. What happens if you make arrests during the ceremony? I asked. We won't, she assured me. Agents will gather intelligence and evidence, but the arrests come later. We don't want to turn your wedding. A true crime podcaster offered 6 figures for recording rights. We need media present but controlled, Caspian explained. Too much coverage and we look like a circus. Too little and we lose the protection publicity gives us. We settled on pool coverage, 3 photographers, 2 video crews, and a single print journalist who'd share content with the rest. Everyone signed agreements limiting coverage to the ceremony itself, not the pre-wedding preparations or family meetings. Coordinating the invitations alone took 3 weeks. Everyone had to be hand-delivered to avoid interception. The wording needed diplomatic precision to avoid causing offense. The RSVP process included background checks on +1s and verification of family relationships. Half the people getting these invitations want to kill the other half. I told the invitation designer, please make sure the calligraphy is absolutely flawless. 2 weeks before the wedding, we hit our first major security breach. Someone broke into my office overnight and photographed every planning document. Nothing was taken, but every detail of our security arrangements was now compromised. Both families know exactly how we're protecting the event. Torres told me grimly, we have to assume they'll plan around it. We spent 3 days completely overhauling our security protocols, swapping vendors, and relocating backup plans. The cost overruns were staggering, but Caspian's family never blinked. Money is irrelevant, his uncle Lorenzo told me when I explained the added expenses. This wedding decides whether our families destroy each other or find peace. Whatever it costs, it's worth paying. 10 days out, we hit our biggest crisis yet. The venue owner received a formal notice from the city condemning the warehouse over structural safety concerns. An anonymous complaint had triggered an inspection that turned up violations we all knew were fabricated. Someone with political pull is trying to shut us down, Torres concluded after reviewing the report. These violations aren't real. We had 400 confirmed guests, vendors arriving in a week, and nowhere to hold the ceremony. Relocating an event this complicated on such short notice seemed impossible. That's when the Romano family's political connections paid off. Within 24 hours, they'd secured a replacement, a nightclub owned by Lorenzo that had been closed for renovation. Not ideal, but available and secure. The space is smaller, Lorenzo explained during our emergency meeting. Capacity's limited to 300 instead of 400, but it has reinforced walls, bulletproof windows, and a secure perimeter. Cutting the guest list by 100 people set off diplomatic nightmares. Which relatives could be uninvited without giving offense? Which friends would understand? How do you explain to a federal judge that the venue changed and there's no longer room for him? My assistant spent 3 days making apologetic phone calls while I worked with vendors to reconfigure everything for the smaller space. The florist redesigned every arrangement. The caterer adjusted quantities. The photographer drew up new lighting plans. This is like planning 2 entirely different weddings, my assistant said after 18 straight hours coordinating the changes. If we survive this weekend, I'm taking a vacation. 5 days before the ceremony, both families got devastating news. Federal prosecutors had unsealed indictments against 17 people from both organizations, including 2 family patriarchs. The charges ranged from racketeering to money laundering to conspiracy to commit murder. The FBI is moving faster than expected. Agent Morrison told me during an emergency briefing. Someone leaked information about the investigation into the wedding. Will there be arrests at the ceremony? I asked. No, the indictments won't be executed until after the wedding. But both families know they're coming. That changed everything. Instead of simply attending a wedding, both families were now facing their last taste of freedom. The ceremony had become a final gathering before their world caved in. They'll be more dangerous now, Torres warned. Desperate people do desperate things. The final week was controlled chaos punctuated by real terror. Vendors arrived early to set up while family members held what looked like last-ditch meetings. Federal agents kept up surveillance while trying to stay invisible. Security teams ran constant threat assessments while the legitimate guests remained blissfully unaware of the danger around them. Delilah spent her last night as a single woman in a safe house, ringed by bodyguards and FBI agents. She looked gorgeous but worn out when I stopped by for her final dress fitting. Do you think we're crazy? She asked, adjusting her veil. Completely, I said honestly, but sometimes crazy is the only sane response to an impossible situation. Saturday morning came in gray and drizzling fitting weather for either a wedding or a funeral. I arrived at the venue at 5 a.m. to oversee the final preparations and found Torres already there, coordinating 3 separate security teams. Federal agents are in position, he reported. Family security's arriving. Local police have the perimeter locked down. Media is setting up outside. Any trouble overnight? 2 false alarms. Someone phoned in a bomb threat, but it traced back to a drunk teenager. A car backfired in the Romano neighborhood and set off a manhunt. The morning passed in a blur of intense preparation. Vendors finished setup while security swept the venue again and again. Family members arrived early, each group claiming a different section of the club and eyeing the others with open suspicion. At noon, Delilah and her wedding party arrived by armored limousine. She looked radiant despite everything, or maybe because of it. Sometimes people shine brightest when facing their biggest challenges. Caspian had spent the night in a separate safe house and arrived on his own with his groomsmen. The moment he saw Delilah, his face lit up with such pure joy that I briefly forgot we were planning a wedding that could turn into a battlefield. The guest list had genuinely become a criminal convention. Federal surveillance logged license plates tied to 5 different organized crime families, 3 federal judges, 2 state senators, 4 police chiefs, and enough firepower to outfit a small army. This is either the most protected wedding in history or the most dangerous, Agent Morrison remarked, watching the last guests file in. At 3 p.m., the ceremony began. 400 people sat in careful segregation, Kozlovs on the left, Romanos on the right, federal agents scattered through the room, and legitimate guests packed in the middle as human shields. The processional music started, and Delilah walked down the aisle, past 3 decades of accumulated hatred. Her father wasn't there to give her away, he'd refused to come. Instead, Babushka Yelena walked her down, the 87-year-old matriarch moving slowly but without hesitation. The minister, Reverend Patrick, was a retired military chaplain who'd volunteered after 3 other clergy had turned the job down. He'd officiated ceremonies in combat zones before and seemed genuinely at ease despite the circumstances. Dearly beloved, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the tense room, we are gathered here in the sight of God and these witnesses to join Delilah and Caspian in holy matrimony. When he asked if anyone objected to the marriage, the silence stretched on and on. I held my breath, bracing for someone to speak up, for gunfire, for the fragile peace to shatter, but the silence held. Do you, Caspian Romano, take Delilah Kozlov to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? I do, Caspian said clearly, his voice steady despite everything. Do you, Delilah Kozlov, take Caspian Romano to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? I do, she answered, tears sliding down her face, though her voice stayed strong. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride. As they kissed, the room broke into applause, some of it genuine joy from friends, some of it polite acknowledgement from family, all of it relief that we'd gotten through the ceremony without bloodshed. The reception opened with careful diplomacy. Both families stayed seated on opposite sides of the room, but the mood was less hostile than expected, as if the solemnity of the ceremony had reminded everyone of something bigger than revenge. Babushka Yelena gave the first toast, rising slowly and lifting her glass of vodka. In Russia we have saying, she began in her thick accent. What is stronger, lion or bear? Answer is, love is stronger than both. Today, love wins. The room drank to that, even the family members who disapproved of the match. Caspian's uncle Lorenzo offered the next toast, choosing his words carefully to honor tradition without acknowledging the criminal side of their conflict. To family, he said simply, may the next generation know more peace than the last. The real surprise came when Viktor Petrov rose to speak. As head of the third crime family present, his words carried real weight. I have watched two families destroy themselves for 30 years, over pride and old grudges, he said, looking directly at representatives of both patriarchs. Tonight, two young people show us another way. Perhaps it's time for all of us to choose love over hatred. His toast seemed to shift the mood in the room. Conversations opened up between family members who hadn't spoken civilly in years. Children from both sides played together while their parents kept a careful but peaceful distance. Dinner service went off without incident, though I noticed security staying alert the entire time. Federal agents circulated with recording equipment, still in their catering disguises. The photographer captured moments that would later surface as evidence in federal trials. Around 9 p.m., as the evening wound down, the inevitable happened. Someone we never figured out who said something that sparked an argument between two family members. Within seconds, both families were on their feet, shouting in multiple languages, reaching for concealed weapons. The lights cut out immediately as Torres triggered emergency protocols. Red emergency lighting flooded the room while security moved to separate the combatants. FBI agents dropped their covers and activated comms. In the dark, I heard the unmistakable sound of weapons being drawn, safeties clicking off, people diving for cover. Women screamed, children cried, glass shattered as someone tried to force their way through the club's reinforced windows. 3 shots rang out, not many, but enough to send the room into full panic. When the main lights came back 30 seconds later, the scene was chaotic but not a bloodbath. Overturned tables, scattered chairs, broken glass, one man bleeding from a shoulder graze. But nobody was dead. Torres and his team had done their job perfectly, using the darkness and confusion to disarm potential combatants before anyone could fire with intent. The FBI agents had held their positions while collecting evidence. The shots had been warning fire into the ceiling, not attempts at murder. Everyone stay calm, Agent Morrison announced, dropping her catering disguise and flashing her federal badge. FBI, nobody moves until we sort this out. The reaction was immediate and entirely predictable. Both families demanded lawyers while agents began making arrests based on outstanding warrants and the weapons violations uncovered during the brief chaos. As handcuffs clicked shut on relatives from both sides, the newlyweds stood at the center of the wrecked reception hall, still in their wedding clothes, holding hands as their world transformed around them. Did we really do it? Delilah asked, surveying the wreckage. We're alive and married, Caspian answered. That's what matters. The aftermath stretched well beyond that chaotic night. FBI raids over the following weeks dismantled both criminal organizations entirely. Asset forfeiture seized properties worth millions. Criminal prosecutions produced 47 federal convictions and prison sentences totaling more than 300 years. But the violence ended for good. Stripped of leadership and infrastructure, the remaining family members no longer had the resources to keep the feud alive. Younger relatives took the opportunity to pursue legitimate careers. Older ones were too tied up in legal defense to plot revenge. The Petrov organization, having stayed neutral throughout the wedding standoff, actually came out ahead. Viktor Petrov absorbed territory once contested between the Kozlovs and Romanos, though federal pressure eventually pushed him to legitimize his operations too. Delilah and Caspian spent 6 months in federal protective custody, testifying against relatives who'd tried to drag them into criminal activity. Their testimony proved crucial in securing convictions against several high-ranking family members. Once released from protection, they relocated to a small town in Oregon and opened an Italian-Russian fusion restaurant. Nobody missed the irony. Their marriage had literally ended a war and led to legitimate collaboration between two cultures. The restaurant became modestly famous once food critics stumbled onto the story behind it. Travel magazines wrote up the peace cuisine, served by former crime family members. The Food Network even produced a documentary about cooking traditions that had outlasted family violence. But mostly, they just lived quietly and happily. My role in the FBI operation stayed classified for 2 years, until Agent Morrison got clearance to discuss it publicly. By then, I'd become known in law enforcement circles as the wedding planner who'd helped bring down organized crime. The reputation was both blessing and curse. Celebrity clients loved that I could handle complicated security situations while keeping things quiet. But I also drew attention from criminal organizations who saw me as a potential liability. I hired permanent security and moved my office to a building with better protection. My assistant quit after receiving death threats and now works at an accounting firm in another state. I don't blame her one bit. She never signed up for federal investigations and criminal prosecutions. Still, business flourished in unexpected ways. Wealthy families with complicated dynamics sought me out specifically because I'd proven I could handle extreme situations. Politicians wanted someone who understood security protocols. Celebrities appreciated my experience managing the media under pressure. 3 years later, I got a card announcing the birth of Delilah and Caspian's first child, a daughter named Hope. The symbolism wasn't subtle, but it was meaningful. She'll grow up in a world without family feuds, Delilah had written. That's the best wedding gift we could give her. The card included a photo from the restaurant's opening day, both sets of grandparents, at least the ones not in federal prison, helping serve customers. Former enemies working side by side to build something good for their grandchild's future. 5 years after the wedding, another update arrived. Caspian had won a seat on the city council in their small Oregon town. Delilah was teaching art therapy to at-risk youth. Their daughter was learning to speak 3 languages, English, Russian, and Italian from grandparents who'd once tried to kill each other. The transformation looked miraculous, until I really thought about what had happened. 2 young people chose love over inherited hatred. They risked everything to break a cycle of violence that had consumed their families for decades, and they did it not through more violence, but through the radical act of committing to peace, publicly. Other criminal families took notice. The The wedding became something of a legend in organized crime circles, not a cautionary tale, but proof that a different path was possible. Several other family feuds ended through negotiated settlements instead of bloodshed. Law enforcement agencies began studying our wedding as a model for using public events to gather intelligence on criminal networks. Agent Morrison developed training protocols based on the operation's success. The key was creating a situation where subjects felt safe enough to attend but exposed enough to be monitored, she explained at a law enforcement conference. The wedding gave us perfect cover for comprehensive surveillance. But for me, the outcome that mattered most was simpler than that. Two people who loved each other got married and lived happily ever after, despite everything working to keep them apart. 7 years on, I still keep those postcards from Delilah and Caspian framed in my office. When brides fuss over minor family drama or stress out over centerpiece colors, I point to those photos and tell a shortened version of the story. Every wedding runs into obstacles, I tell them. The question is whether you love each other enough to get past them. Most couples find their own problems a lot more manageable after hearing about a ceremony planned under FBI surveillance with crime families pointing guns at each other. But the deeper lesson is really about the power of love to transform hatred. Delilah and Caspian didn't just get married, they ended a war. Their wedding became the spark that pushed their families to choose peace over violence, cooperation over conflict. Sometimes I wonder if I peaked too early in this career. How do you top an event that brought down 3 criminal organizations and ended a multi-generational blood feud? Then I remember that every wedding, at its heart, comes down to the same choice. Two people deciding love is stronger than whatever's trying to keep them apart, disapproving parents, financial strain, cultural gaps, or armed crime families. The obstacles shift, but the choice never changes. Love or fear, peace or conflict, hope or despair. Delilah and Caspian chose love, and it changed everything. That's what real weddings are about, not perfect flowers or flawless photos, but imperfect people making perfect promises to face the future side by side. And sometimes, if you're lucky and brave enough, those promises grow powerful enough to change the world. 10 years later, I got one last update from Oregon. Delilah and Caspian now owned 3 restaurants and employed several dozen people from both sides of their once warring families. Their daughter Hope was thriving in school, planning to study international relations, inspired by watching her parents resolve conflict through communication instead of violence. Most striking of all, their annual family reunion now included members of both the former Kozlov and Romano organizations, along with their children and grandchildren. What had once been sworn enemies were now extended family, bound together by a shared commitment to their children's peaceful future. The last line of Delilah's letter has stuck with me ever since. Some people inherit hatred, others choose to inherit hope. That choice between inheriting hatred or choosing hope defines not just successful marriages, but successful lives. I've planned hundreds of weddings since then, each with its own challenges and complications. But none has matched the stakes or the impact of that April ceremony, when 2 young people chose love over war and changed the course of multiple families for good. Sometimes love really can conquer all. You just have to be brave enough to let it try.